What is just a hair?
Oh, come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel, that was in lonely exile here, until the Son of God appear. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to thee, O Israel.
Well, good evening and welcome to our worship service for Christmas Eve. It is a pleasure to see you all. We have been on a journey through Lent, and we have gone through the Sundays of peace and hope and joy and trust to arrive here this evening where we actually get to light our final candle. The candle where we remember what all of this is about, the coming of God in the form of the person of Jesus Christ. So I invite you this evening to set aside all of the busyness and craziness and all of the things that are on your to-do list that I know are haunting some of you as you prepare for friends and family and gifts and all of that. But instead, give this time to remembering what this season is for, the coming of love, the coming of grace, the coming of our Lord Jesus. I invite you now to sing our next song. I'd invite you this evening to join me in a time of prayer. Gracious, holy, loving, and everlasting God, we have set apart part of this time. We have come to this place, stepped out of all of the busyness, all of the things to do, all of the presents to be wrapped and the food to be cooked, the houses to be cleaned, and have come to this time in this place, hoping and trusting God that here we will find a little bit of the Christmas spirit, the little bit of the reason that we do all that we do. God, we come here in hopeful expectation, looking for grace, looking for love, looking for peace, looking for a reminder that this world that we inhabit truly is yours, that you did create it and you called it good. So God, as we gather here this evening, as we come to visit with friends and family, old and new, we just ask that your Spirit be upon us, that your Spirit flow through this time, and that in all we do, we hear, we touch, we feel, we sense your presence. God, we also know that this time of year that we know as a time of joy is not a joy for all. For some, it is the first time we come to this time without our loved one with us. So God, we remember them. Remember those who are feeling loss. Remember those who are feeling lost. God, we also lift up to you all of those who desire to be with us, who desire to be with their friends and family but cannot. God, we especially remember tonight our service members who are serving far from home, serving for us. God, however we enter this place, whether we enter this place frantic, whether we enter this place in joy and gladness, whether we enter this place in sadness, however we enter this time, God, we know and trust that we will find you here. So God, if we can ask so humbly that you please send your Son, that you send us that living embodiment of your love and grace, that ever-present reminder of how far you are willing to go to be in good relationship with us. This morning, God, this evening, God, we lift up to you this time. We lift up to you this season. We lift up to you all that we have done and all that we will do. And we lift it up in your name. And we do it together, God, in one congregation coming from many various places. We do it by praying this prayer that your Son taught us to pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. This evening, as it is the tradition in our church, we take an offering, and 100% of the offering we collect tonight we actually give away. And tonight's offering is going to support the agricultural mission that happens at Keswa, which is in eastern Angola, Africa. This is the United Methodist Ministry, one that we've gotten to know over the last couple of years. People from this ministry have come to visit us. And the aim of their group is to teach people who live in a version of poverty that is almost beyond description, how to learn to sustainably fend from themselves, to become self-sufficient and lift themselves and their children out of that poverty. It is an amazing mission, and again, 100% of what is given tonight will go to that ministry, so I invite you to give generously.
Good evening. Our scripture for this evening is from Isaiah chapter 9, verses 2 through 7. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who lived in a land of deep darkness, on them light has shined. You have multiplied the nation, you have increased its joy. They rejoice before you as with a joy at the harvest, as people exult when dividing plunder. For the yoke of their burden and the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor you have broken, as on the day of Midian. For all the boots of the trampling warriors and all the garments rolled in blood shall be burned as fuel for the fire. For a child has been born to us, a son given to us. Authority rests upon his shoulders, and his name is Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God. Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, his authority shall grow continually, and there shall be endless peace for the throne of David and his kingdom. We will establish and uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time onwards and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. The word of the Lord.
Well, good evening once again. We find ourselves here again on Christmas Eve, time of great anticipation and excitement for some, especially if you are hoping for something amazing under the tree. That time of my life ended a while ago, but that's okay. Now it's more fun to put stuff under the tree, right? So we have been dealing with this idea of unwrapping Christmas, where we're taking a second look at things that we do at this time of year and wondering maybe a little bit, why do we do them and what purpose do they serve? So we're going to finish that up this evening together. And you know, we're doing it with this rather familiar passage, or at least sections of today's passage from the prophet Isaiah are familiar. It's one we run into a lot this time of year, which is interesting. And it's interesting because Isaiah actually wrote this about 800 years before Jesus' birth. And for those 800 years or so, this prophecy was interpreted in a bunch of different ways. And one of the ways that it was primarily used was an understanding of what earthly kings ought to be like. Now, we've talked about kings before in here, and we know that we don't live in a world with kings, so it's hard for us to kind of wrap our head around it. But in the time Isaiah is writing, and up through the time of Jesus, a king was kind of the primary form of government. Now, if you remember anything about the Old Testament, or when we've talked about this before, you will remember that the idea of Israel, the idea of God's people having a king over them, was not God's idea at all. And in fact, the people got together and looked around at all the other countries around them and said, you know, all these other places around us, they all have kings, and that seems to be working out pretty well for them. Wouldn't it be great if we had one too? And so people went, and people went, and a lot of people prayed to God, and God got back to them and said, you know, no, that's not going to work out well for you. Like, I don't think that's a good idea. But the people actually persisted, and they persisted over and over and over again. And finally, God acquiesces and says, fine, if you want a king, I will give you a king. And that's where we get Saul and David and Solomon and all of these folks. Now, at the time Isaiah is writing, this has been going on for a while. There have been several kings of Israel, and about 25% of them, it worked out okay, and about 75% of them get about 4 lines of scripture associated with them, and the 4 lines go something like, this person became king, they were terrible, something happened, they're not king anymore, right? Like that's basically most of 1st and 2nd Kings. I hate to ruin it for you. Read it if you want to. But most of these kings, they ruled for 20 years, and they get 3 lines of verse, and the 3 lines of verse are, you weren't very good at your job. They either killed you or got rid of you. You're not king anymore, right? And it had been centuries of this by the time Isaiah is writing, and 3 out of 4 of these folks had not turned out well. So here's Isaiah writing this thing about kings and what kings ought to be like and what they ought to do, and that's where we start to get these amazing things like Prince of Peace and Wonderful Counselor. Now, one of them was this guy, Jeroboam. So Jeroboam was he was a winner. So Jeroboam was the king about 150 years before Isaiah was writing, and this was at a time when actually the kingdom of Israel was actually two kingdoms. There was a northern kingdom of Israel, and there was a southern kingdom of Judea. And he was the king of the northern kingdom of Israel, and he got tired of all of his people going to the southern kingdom to worship because that's where the temple was. So he came up with a really good idea. So he had some people come together, and he made himself 2 golden calves. Now, if you've even seen, like, the children's movie about Moses, right, you know this is a bad idea, right? But he does it anyway. He gets these 2 golden calves, and he puts them in different places in his kingdom and says, you don't have to go to Jerusalem anymore, you don't have to go to the temple anymore. Go to these golden calves, and you can pray there. And he actually makes this proclamation, which is interesting, we shall say. He says that when he's presenting these golden calves to the people, he says, behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Now again, if you know anything of the story of Moses, if you've even seen the cartoon, right, you know that's not how it worked, right? The golden calf was not a good thing, right? It was a substitute. It was a poor substitute for God that God didn't particularly care for. So here we have Jeroboam, and he sets this whole, and so you can imagine his reign lasted so long, and it did not end well for him. These were kings when Isaiah was writing. Now Isaiah was actually writing in the time of one king in particular, and I want to make sure I get the name right. He's writing in the time of Hezekiah. Now Hezekiah actually didn't do too bad. Hezekiah spent his time undoing a lot of the not great things that all the kings before him did. So there is some optimism about kings and what kings might do at the time that Isaiah is writing his prophecies. Now the problem is, Hezekiah was the king, and then Hezekiah had a son, and let's just say like the apple like fell off the tree and like rolled far, far away. And Hezekiah's son, who takes over, is probably one of the worst kings that Israel has ever had. So there's this back and forth, and there's this idea that, like, what do we do with all of these folks? So by the time we get to Jesus, by the time we get to the New Testament authors who love to talk about prophecy actually don't mention this one, right? Because even in the time they are, kings are still a mixed bag. It isn't until later when followers of Christ begin to look back at some of these things. It's not later until followers of Jesus start to look at some of these things and go, well, wait a minute. Maybe Isaiah was never actually talking about earthly kings. Maybe the son that is going to be born to us isn't like that. What if Isaiah is trying to tell us? What if what God is trying to tell us through Isaiah is about something else? What if it's about this person that we've met, this thing that we know, this person of Jesus? And so that's where this passage gets folded into the Christian tradition and becomes one of those things we come to, and especially we come to this time of year to remind us who Jesus is supposed to be, who Jesus needs to be in the world, and who Jesus is supposed to be in our lives. Wonderful Counselor, the Prince of Peace, the one who brings love and grace and joy, the one whose burden is easy and yoke is light. So Christians rediscover this passage and they realize, oh, God was up to something the whole time, and Jesus, and that thing that God is up to is Jesus. Now, in the church we have a fancy word. We have a lot of fancy words because we like to make up words. We do. That's why I have a job. All right. And one of the words that we made up, well, not really, but one of the words we use is we call this thing called atonement. And atonement is basically a fancy way of saying the work that is done, the work that God does to to mend the relationship between us and God. It's the bridge God builds and continues to build between us and God so that we can be in relationship with God. And when we tend to think about atonement, we actually tend to think about it more in light of what's going to happen 2 or 3 months from now at Easter when you all come back. Don't think we don't notice. All right. But we think about it in terms of Easter. But the truth is the work of atonement doesn't actually start at Easter, and it doesn't start at Good Friday. The work of atonement actually starts here. The work of building the relationship, mending the relationship, providing this opportunity for us to experience all that God has to offer to us begins here at Christmas. And it begins by Jesus, first and foremost, showing up. As people, we tend to undervalue the importance of showing up in the first place. Jesus can't do all the things he does. He can't teach all the things he does. He can't heal the way he does. He can't go to the cross, and he can't be resurrected if he doesn't first come, if he doesn't first show up here. Oftentimes, the biggest thing that we can do, the most important thing that we can do is first and foremost be present, show up, and bring our best selves with us. Oftentimes, showing up and bringing your best self to some place is the best gift that you can give anybody. And if you're not sure what showing up and being fully present looks like, just look around at anybody under the age of 10, right? Because they don't know how to not show up, right? There's something that happens when we are a child that we just don't know how to not bring all of ourselves, for better or worse, to everything that we are doing, right? And that is certainly true in the case of my children. Somewhere around, I think it was Gavin's, my eldest son, around his 5th birthday. We were living in Ohio. We decided to visit some friends in Chicago, so we went and visited them. And Chicago, they have a lot of things, including really tall buildings. One you may have heard of. It's not called the Sears Tower anymore, which is lame. I think it's like the Willis Tower or something ridiculous like that, but we called it the Sears Tower because that's what I know it as. So we're like, we're there. We're like, we want to go see the Sears Tower. I've never been up in a building that high. I thought this will be fun. And it's over Christmas vacation, so obviously this is a really good idea. Not at all. And so we go, and my aunt and uncle, they're like, sure, we'll go with you. And they take us down there, and we stand in this little line out in the cold, all of us there. And Gavin's just kind of having a good time. And then we get through the doors only to discover that was like the pre-line, the line before the line. And so we look at this other line, we're like, oh, goodness. And so we get through that line. And then the line actually takes you to the elevator, which takes you most of the way there before you get to another line and then another elevator. Some of you have done this. And I don't honestly, we stopped keeping track because it would not have been good for our souls about how long this actually took. But it took a good long while to the point where all of the adults are getting cranky, and Gavin is just looking around in awe of everything that he was seeing, and he's like this, and the elevator went really quick, and he thought that was the greatest thing on the planet. So the point where we started in the daylight, and by the time we got to the top, it was dark, and so we're looking around, we're looking at all these lights, and somewhere along the line, somebody had decided that being like 110 stories up wasn't exciting enough, and so they made these giant plexiglass boxes that they extend over the end of the building. Yeah, the torture devices, let's just be honest about what they are. So that you can stand in this giant plexiglass box and look down 100 and some odd stories and look all these other places. And I looked at that and I was like, oh no. And I turned to my wife and she has this look on me, like, nah. And before we can even exchange word, Gavin was like a shot out into this farthest corner of the box as he could go. And he was looking down, and he's looked back at us, and he's smiling. He's like, look, Dad. And I'm like, I can see fine from here. Thank you very much. And he's looking down, and we're like, and it just kept going. And finally, my wife and I looked at her, like, well, somebody's going to have to get him out of there. Rock, paper, scissors. Gavin didn't know how to be present, how to not be present. He didn't know how to just take every bit that moment offered He didn't know how to not bring his whole self to what was going on. Somewhere along life, as we get older and older, for some reason, we find this harder and harder. For some reason, we lose track of the reality that we are actually all gifts. We are all gifts. We are all in some way some gift to the world that God has made. And somewhere along the way, we lose track of that. And we stop thinking about ourselves in that way. And we stop putting ourselves out there in that way. And we stop sharing that part of ourselves. God came in the person of Jesus to be present with us, fully present, bringing everything he had to offer. We are all made in God's image. We have all been given that gift. We all have something to share and offer the world. And yet, for some reason, many of us along the way have gotten out of the habit of showing up. We've gotten out of the habit of bringing our best selves. This Christmas, and not just for Christmas, but beyond, what would it look like if we did? What would it look like if we came to the situations of life that we encounter and brought the best of who we are and trusted that God gave us each gifts to share and bless the world? Because you very well may be the gift that somebody else needs to receive. Now, let me give you a little tip. Tomorrow, if you are gathering together with family and you encounter that cousin maybe you haven't seen for a while, if you open the conversation with them with, "How about that impeachment?" you are not bringing your best self to that moment. The truth is, whether we want to believe it or not, see it or not, know it or not, pretend it doesn't exist, we can't escape the fact that we are all God's children, that God is deeply in love with each one of us, that when God placed us on the earth, he placed us on this earth with skills and abilities and talents not to be hoarded and not to be hidden, but to be shared. And that when we are willing to just simply be present, when we are willing to drop all the pretense and come with all that we have, oftentimes we are the gift. We can be the gift that the world needs, that your neighbor needs, that your cousin needs, that your mom needs. And when we recognize that about ourselves, oftentimes we also recognize that those who are around us, those friends and family that we hold dear, are often the gift that we need as well. May we be the gifts we need this Christmas. Amen.
Awesome.
So now it is time for my favorite part of the service, where I get to invite you to stand, and we are going to sing together as we share the light with one another. Chris, our lay leader, will join me in this, and I would just ask one thing. I did it wrong. Please make sure you dip your unlit candle into the lit one.
Virgin
you prepare to leave this place, I'm going to invite you to let your light shine high. Remember, you are a gift that God has given the world. You are beloved. You are worthy. You are loved. And this season, amongst all seasons, we remember how far God is willing to go to make sure that we know that. So go forth. Bring all that you are. Bring your whole self. Bring everything you have. Amen.
Amen.